Whenever, not now, whenever.
Hello, Reds, and welcome along to All for United. That was Roy. You could hear him. He's always the first to speak on these shows, as you know. Welcome along to this special tribute show to George Best, a true genius. I am so excited about this show because we have got three fantastic panelists who are not just going to widen your knowledge of George Best as a footballer and the man off the pitch, but also tell you some fantastic stories that you might not have heard before. If you've watched any of the shows that we've done with the Manchester Munich Memorial Foundation, you'll know the stories that Roy tells. He is just an incredible encyclopedia of knowledge, and the stories he has to tell are just incredible. And he chomped at the bit to come on the show about George Best. So I can't wait to hear more about Roy. Barry, we know he always talks about George Best on any show. He always talks about his love for United in the 70s, the 80s, and yesteryear. And I'm really excited to have Barry. And do you know what the two links are between Roy, Barry, and Wayne? Is that Roy and Barry spoke to Wayne when he was putting together his book. Author Wayne Barton, who produced a stunning book, True Genius, George Best. It's a definitive family-backed account of his remarkable career, published to coincide with what would have been his 75th birthday. The gains, the goals, the glory. It is truly his untold story, and it's a fantastic book that you need to go and check out. I'm going to put the link in the description and check out the All for United Twitter account to click through to Amazon to buy the book. It's a must read, especially after we've hit on some of the stuff that is in it. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us this evening on All for United. Thank you for joining our panel to chat about George Best. Can I ask you, first of all, you're an author. You could have picked any player to write your next book on. You chose George Best. I know the 75th birthday is obviously anniversary is a big thing, but why else? Why did you want to dig deeper into George Best?
Yeah, the 75th thing was a massive coincidence, really. It was one of those like happy coincidences that the timing worked for that. Why George Best? It was actually one of my friends, Dan. He messaged me and he said, it's one of those things, because I've written about George, I've written about footballers before, I've written about United, written a lot of books on United, and talked to a lot of people like Harry Gregg, Brian Greenough, all these people I've been working through through the years would always tell me stories about George. And because I write about United, obviously one of the things was, hopefully one day I'll be able to write a book about George, but the time had to be right to be able to do that, to be able to add something to the library of the many brilliant George Best books that are out there. And my friend Dan actually messaged me and he said, you know what, I think you should write that book about George now. And I took a little bit of convincing. My wife and one of my other best friends talked to me about it, and they said, we basically went through the things that I could add. And the idea was, I could write a book about his football and just about his football, because that's the one thing that was missing from, funnily enough, about George. The one thing that was missing is this story about his football. There aren't that many. Well, there weren't that many stories about his early days at United, the youth team days, but also the stories of him going elsewhere after United. That story is almost like an anticlimax, and I guess that in some regards it is, but because of that, those stories aren't really gone into in much detail, and that's where sort of like Barry comes in, really, because I wanted to go through each of the stories of all of the clubs that he went to after. So that more or less started with South Africa, and I talked to Barry and asked him if he knew anything. He was a wealth of information. So yeah, that's a kind of a little brief history of why George Best. But if you write about if you write about United, then George is one of those people that you want to write about. So it was more a case of getting the time right to think that I had something to add. And I think that the time was right, because obviously I was very enthusiastic about writing it when I did. So yeah, that's basically how it came about.
Can I ask about the name of the book, Wayne? True Genius, and also about the family's backing, because you've been really vocal in saying about how fantastic the family have been with you releasing this book. So can I just ask a little bit around, what that was like, getting the backing, how supportive they've been, and True Genius? Why True Genius?
So True Genius was actually suggested by the publisher. my publisher's really good, Reach Sport. I have a really good working relationship with them, and I'll put working titles on my manuscripts that I send to them, and they will come back with some suggestions. And True Genius was one. I didn't know it at the time, but Genius was the first title for George's autobiography, Blessed. And his agent called me. His former agent, Phil Hughes, called me, and he said, I don't know if you know this, but Genius would have been the first title for that, but he rejected it because he was too modest for it. So it was actually a nice sort of kismet kind of thing that came about. And obviously George could have rejected that because he was too modest. But when someone's not here, or if you're writing a biography about someone, then it's your right to describe them as you wish, as long as it's a good thing. And obviously True Genius is the ultimate tribute to him, and it sums up everything about the cover of the book. The presentation of it sums up the story that I wanted to tell. His family involvement that was along the lines of one of those things that I could add that nobody else had done before. So I contacted the family, and obviously a number of people have written books on George, and they've always talked to the family about it and sort of promised that they were going to do something that paints George in a good light. And a few times that they've been burned by that because people have gone down the route of George's problems. So obviously at first, they could have been a little bit apprehensive with me. And, I contacted different members of George's family, and some people were a little bit apprehensive. But I asked them for the trust. They gave it. Mm-hmm. And they've been very supportive of it. They provided a forward. I'm in contact with different members of George's family, and everyone's been really supportive of it. I'm sure you've seen on social media how brilliant Callum's been in supporting it. So yeah, I'm just really, really chuffed that I wrote something that I followed through my promise that I would paint George in a positive light, and that they could see that I did that. And now it's just sort of left to the gods whether people think it's a good read or not.
Well, one of the first comments we've had through Wayne, Gaynor, who always says exactly what Gaynor thinks. It's a brilliant read. I've just finished reading it. And Therese has said, looking forward to reading the book. We're going to get the links out at All for United. Make sure you follow us. True Genius, George Best, Wayne Barton, the author. And we're now going to hit on some of the stories in the book. But before I do, Roy, I always come over with this question when we do a show like this, a tribute show, because I think it's really important that people out there are able to get a sense of how a footballer makes a fan feel. We've been lucky in my time, I've been lucky to experience how David Beckham makes me feel, how Cristiano Ronaldo makes me feel. And by hearing from you how George Best made you feel, I think it just helps paint a picture. So George Best, when you watched him play, how did he make you feel?
Well, George is a year older than myself. I am really that old. But when I first saw him, he just had that certain something about him. There are only one or two footballers when I've very, very first seen him have that effect. Strange, Paddy Cretan was one. I remember his first game, and you thought, wow, this is a player. But I've been watching United since 1955, so I saw the Busby Babes 2-3 years before the crash, and know all about Duncan Edwards, and his legendary status. Quite correct. I even wrote the first book on him with Ian McCartney. But Duncan, of course, sadly, only had 5 years to fulfil his genius. And he was the first truly great player I saw. But Best, even now, even at my age, and since Best, Dennis Law, of course, Bobby was always around then. Then in the 80s, Brian Robson, fantastic. Then Cantona. But there's been loads of brilliant players, magnificent players. But those are the type of players that have actually just excited you, energized you. And every time I watch Best play, he played for the team. He really did. He gave his all for United. I know sometimes he perhaps should have passed the ball, etc. But when I say he gave his all for the team, he was just truly exciting. And then I knew him before. I'd seen him quite regularly before he'd made the first team, because we both used to go to the same 10-pin bowling alley near the cricket ground, near the foot, which is across the way from the football ground. And I used to see him every Tuesday and Thursday night. The word that Barry used before, he was a modest man. He really was, sipping coke and just there with the other young players. And then I hosted him at sports dinners when he'd retired, and the older he got, and he used to do talks with Rodney Marsh. It's difficult to put it into words, but if you think of the players I've just mentioned, Duncan Edwards, Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, Eric Cantona, in my lifetime, and Best has left the biggest impact on me. And I think when you look at his record, he justifies the accolades which people have given him. And Wayne obviously has articulated it as only he can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very good points, and very, very and some fantastic stories already, Roy. Thank you for that. Barry, what about you? How did George Best make you feel when you watched him play?
Well, I have to say that carrying on Roy's thread, all these players that he mentions that have become legends of the club, the Ronaldos, the Cantonas, the Robsons, the Buckens, the Charltons, Laws, etc. I was born just after the Munich air crash, so I didn't have the privilege of watching the Busby Babes. But George Best stands, for me, head and shoulders above all of those, because he was just the real deal. And I think Wayne's title of the book, True Genius, the word legend gets bandied about too often. And, if you look at genius in terms of genius people, the Einsteins of the world, etc., I think genius is very appropriate for George. And of course, in South Africa, having followed since the kind of early to mid 60s, we weren't privy to television in those years. We relied on newspapers. And in fact, Wayne's book brought to life for me brought back many, many memories that I have of George. And for example, the first memory I have of him is seeing a photograph of him at the end of a game against Burnley, in wearing one boot, carrying a boot in his other hand, and he'd actually played part of the game running in his stockinged foot, of course, mesmerizing the Burnley defense. It brought that back to life. And, I think when we write our CVs or our experiences in life, one of the things that I put on mine is I saw George Best play. And what a privilege it was, because he was absolutely electric. And I'm going to hold up. This is a program that I watched Bestie play. Man United were visitors at Chelsea, November of 1967. And I happened to be on a family visit to the UK, and my dad took me to watch United play. And for me, this was the most thrilling thing. And in fact, in Wayne's book, he actually mentions that United's goal that game was scored by Brian Kidd and set up by a back heel by George Best. I remember it. I can see it in front of my eyes now, all those years later, and that's the effect that he had on one. The 60s, the era of the Beatles, and of course he got one of the many monikers that he got was the fifth Beatle. And I think it was appropriate because he was probably just as popular as them. And there was a buzz every time he got the ball. And as far as his playing skills were concerned, for me, besides the fact that he was two-footed, that he had a fantastic heading ability, unbelievable dribbling skills, his bravery is what stood out for me above everything. Because lo and behold, you were in the era of Chopper Harris and Bite Your Legs Hunter and all these fellows, that when George Best was on the field, all they wanted to do was hack him down, because there was no other way of stopping him. His skill was sublime, and today still, watching videos of him, I'm absolutely enthralled by him. So for me, the greatest player ever, and Wayne has absolutely brought to life, I think, George's career, and he's done a terrific job. I gobbled down that book in one weekend. It was absolutely magnificent.
Isn't it brilliant that play you're talking about there, Barry, was initially told by a club over in Northern Ireland that he was too small and light to play football for them, and then he was scouted by Manchester United, and was it Bishop I'm sure
Bob
it was
Bishop.
Bishop, told Sir Matt, I found you a genius. And funnily enough, a true genius he did find there, Wayne.
Yeah.
Looking at your chapters of your book, obviously, you know, you've done a lot of research and a lot of study on this. I want to go back to Best's early years. As I said, he had a knockback, quite a big knockback for him, being a local boy, being turned down by one of his local teams. He got scouted by United. I know he went through a stage where he was homesick, wasn't he? So came over and went back home. But you wrote about him being and one of your chapters is dedicated to him being a teen sensation. How highly rated was he over in Northern Ireland? And when he finally got to United, how much did they cherish him, even as a youngster?
So it took him a little bit of time. Bob Bishop did say that line, I think I found you a genius, but he needed a little bit of persuading. At first, he thought George was too small. You're absolutely right. George came over with Eric McMurday and was he was too nervous. He saw the likes of Harry Gregg, and he was overawed by it. I think he arrived in Liverpool after getting off the ferry, had a breakfast there, arrived in Manchester where Joe Armstrong picked him up, and Joe Armstrong put another breakfast in front of him, and he was so fearful that he had two full breakfasts. But then he was like, he got to Old Trafford and he was like, "What am I doing here? These players are household names, and I'm this." He called himself a raggle-taggle scrubber from Belfast, which is just extraordinary. So he and Eric McMurday decided that it wasn't for them, and they went back. His father Dickie and Matt Busby and Joe Armstrong, they sort of put together a little sort of breadcrumbing to entice him back to Old Trafford, to sort of play to his ego a little bit and say, your chance is gone. You'll never get that chance again. And they did give him that other chance, and he went over and he sort of took it straight away. The thing about George, straight away, and I must thank Roy, by the way. I thanked Barry earlier, but Roy's memories of him being around in Salford before George was even in the first team and hanging with the youth team and everything like that really helped me paint a picture of who George was as a teenager, breaking into that side and learning to cope with life in Manchester. So thank you, Roy, for that. The thing with George, he had what he described as a number of explosions in his teenage years, and they would come in internal games where he would think, internal games within the club, like training sessions and things like that, where he would train with the senior players and chip Harry Gregg in training or go around him in training, and suddenly realise that he was good enough to play with, the players at the club. And then in the first division, once he had a few games in the first division, he had a game a little bit earlier than the one that Barry went to, but at Stamford Bridge, where he was ferocious, and they called that an explosion, where this is maybe 9 or 10 months into his first division career, and people were saying he was the best player in the first division within 9 or 10 months, and he was only 17 or 17, 18 at that time. Then obviously he had the big explosion, which he described, which was Lisbon in '66, and he was still a teenager then, which Paddy Crerand told me for the book that he believed at that moment George had become the best player in the world, and he was still only 19. And Antonio Simoes played for Benfica on that night, and he obviously they lost 5-1. It was the first time they ever lost at home in Europe, and he just said it was a privilege to be on the pitch with him, even though they'd suffered this catastrophic defeat. He said on that night George was a prince but became a king. I don't know if it's quite if it's easy enough to translate to a modern audience that how rare it was that a 19-year-old was the best player in the world, or that people thought that he was. It was unheard of. It was simply unheard of. He was doing things that other players just didn't do. So Duncan Edwards, for example, is a great example that he was this dynamo of a midfielder. He was sort of like every aspect of every great professional that had played before, but enhanced. Whereas George was different. He did things his own way. He did things that people hadn't thought of before. And he's so apt that he came around the same time of the Beatles, because like the Beatles effectively created pop music in a certain sense. It's like John Lennon, with the guitar, he's learning he's basically creating these blueprints for the likes of, Oasis and all those bands to follow. It's like George Best created the A code for footballers. He was scoring from corner kicks and meaning to do it. I mean, that's so rare that no one even does that these days. Messi doesn't do it. Ronaldo doesn't do it. You don't see players taking a corner kick and saying, I'm going to score from this corner kick, practicing to do it. He was so far ahead of his peers that his talent was limitless. And I don't say everything that I've just said in that sentence lightly. That's how good he was. He was so far ahead of everyone, and that was at the age of like 19, 20. He was so far ahead that he was by far and away the best player in the world.
You mentioned some of the stories there that Roy shared with you. Roy, let me just naturally come straight over to you, especially on George Best's youth days. Do you remember, I know that you used to watch a lot of youth football. Do you remember seeing George Best at all as a young lad? Do you have any memories of that? And also, whilst you talk about that, is there any way that you can maybe express to anyone watching a transition Best went through from being that small young lad, just joining United, playing for United, and when he reached that night in Lisbon, when he reached his peak, and how much of a different player he truly was?
Yeah, I've not got the figures to hand. Wayne may have, but he didn't play that many FA Youth Cup games, for example, and he didn't play that many reserve games, a bit like Duncan Edwards, where you'd think a 17, 18-year-old to get in the Manchester United first team will have played 40, 50 games in the reserves. I'd be surprised if Best played anywhere near that number of games in the reserves. But he obviously was making the impact in training, like Wayne said. And I was there for the West Bromwich Albion game on the Saturday, and I'd seen him the week before in the reserves, and he'd had a good game. But not many people. The actual programme has Ian Moyer at number 7, who was a bit of a flying winger, and he got hurt. And suddenly, here are the team changes. United, number 7, Best. And people in the paddock where I was, or United Road, stood up there. Who was this? I said, he's in reserves, and he's had a couple of games in the youth team. And he came on the pitch, and he seemed to put his head he seemed to play with his head on his shoulder. And he was a waif, really. He was a waif. Wet through. I don't think he'd be 9 stone. He was just this thin lad, and neat black hair, young, and he got the ball and he was taken up to this grizzly fullback, Graham Williams, who was a decent Wales international, and he was taking him outside, he was taking him inside, he was getting kicked, but he kept going, and he had a really decent game. And then Matt took him out because Moyer became fit. And then that was September. And then Boxing Day, they got hammered 6-1 at Burnley. Paddy got sent off, and Matt rang Belfast and said, you better get your legs back over here. You're in the team when we play them tomorrow or the day after. And George came in, and this game he played number 11. The first game was 7. He played number 11. Willie Anderson, who was potentially as good as him at that time, he played at number 7. And George played 11, and he had a fantastic game. And they beat Burnley 5-1. And he was never out of the team then. He was never out of the team. So he was very young with really limited experience of the number of games. He played a lot of games in the A team, at B team, but reserves, he didn't play that many. And then the January, that was Boxing Day 63, January 64, they won 4-1 at West Brom in the return game. And Dennis came back from a suspension, and Bobby had been injured, and George was there. That was the first time all three played together. And they all scored. They won 4-1. And they were just, he was there. As Wayne said, he was then in the team. He was then in the team for good. The year after, Barry mentions the game there at 66, November 66 at Chelsea. But 64-65, the game Wayne was alluding to, the earlier game at Stamford Bridge, he absolutely ran Chelsea ragged. United won 2-0, 66,000 at Stamford Bridge on a Wednesday night. And, they won the league. And he was a vital member of that league side. and then the year after in the European Cup. And incredibly, when he did what he did in Lisbon in March '66, he really was as good a player as any in the world. And that was less than 2 years, really, about 2 years since his debut. He was absolutely incredible. And it was so sad that another 2 years on from that, we won the European Cup, and he was on 22, something like that. And he was really at his pinnacle. And, you can't get over how brilliant he was. The one really unlucky thing, he very rarely got injured, very rarely. But he got a bad injury. I think it was at Preston in the cup tie in '66 after around the Benfica. I think it was after the Benfica game, obviously. And he couldn't play. He had his leg was all strapped up against Partizan Belgrade in the semi-final. And really, we should have won the European Cup that year. But he was a man before he was a boy. And you could say that about Edwards, but Edwards physically was like that. Best was a total different scheme or scale, but he was unique, a genius.
A genius. Everyone, whenever we say something, uses the word genius somewhere within what we're saying, which I think pays kudos to the man and says quite a lot. Guys, I'm sure as you can appreciate, the comments are really sounding off, but we're not going to be able to get to every comment, I'm afraid, because there's so many questions I want to ask tonight's panel, and there's so many stories and so much we want to get through. So what I'm going to do throughout the show is, if you do leave something in the live chat, I'm going to put it up on screen. I hope that's okay with everyone. I'll put those up on screen. So if you want to share a memory on George Best, or you want to hit on something that the guys are talking about maybe, and something that comes to your mind, please just put it in the live chat and I'll get over to it. And everyone right now, please hit like on this video. Show some love to Wayne, Roy and Barry, and of course to the tribute show for George Best. Barry, let me come over to you. I feel like for anyone watching right now, if we really need to spell it out to someone, how George Best played and what an influence he was on the pitch, I think now's the time to do it. We've hit in about his genius and the little things he could do. We've spoken about games. But George Best as a footballer, what was he like consistently? For you, what were his attributes?
Right. Well, if I may just, if you don't mind, I'm going to backtrack one moment. Roy mentioned his first game. Here's the program from his first game, where United West Brom. And if you look at the team sheet, exactly as he said, they had Ian Moyer at number 7, and of course George was a late selection over there.
Roy's memory is honestly like nothing I have ever come across before.
You'll never catch him out, that's for sure. That's for sure. In terms of attributes, I think that George could have played in any position on the field. As I mentioned earlier, his bravery. So, it's true that he would beat a man and he would turn around and beat him again. And the harder they kicked him, the more he came back for more. It must have been exasperating to play against him. And of course, in those days, to get sent off, you'd probably have to half murder somebody. Red cards, the card system was not in effect in those days. But to get sent off, you'd probably have to commit grievous bodily harm. And if in those days, players would have been punished as they are today, I really think the opposition probably would have been left with about 3 players at the end of a game, because they were all into kicking George. His balance was phenomenal. If you look at a guy like Messi, who's got a low center of gravity and fantastic balance, George had that. Powerful shot in both feet. And I mean, a wide player, and he still scored, I think I'm right, Roy may correct me, 179 goals for United. He's one of United's leading goal scorers of all time. So fantastic shot with either foot. And of course, his dribbling skills were absolutely sublime, good in the air, brave, and his fullbacks liked him because he used to come back and help defend. He hardly ever missed a game, as Roy said. He hardly ever got injured, which is amazing to think of, given all the treatment that was meted out to him. And they say that his legs were black and blue at the end of every game. His only major injury was that cartilage injury of 1966, which I think United probably would have prevailed in the European Cup had he not been injured at that time. But when he got the ball, the stadium became alive, absolutely electric. There'd be a buzz. And of course, he wanted the ball all the time. And in fact, we heard a lovely story from Bobby Charlton when he was here. because they asked him about George Best, and Bobby was saying that playing with George at times could be exasperating because you'd run into space, you'd wait for the ball, and he'd kind of be under his breath. He mentioned on one occasion he was muttering, "George, you bloody," and the next comment, "Oh, what a brilliant goal." And that's how George was. And my on this visit to the UK that I mentioned, on the day that we arrived there, United had beaten Liverpool the day before, 2-1 at Anfield, with George scoring both goals. And in fact, in Wayne's book, he talks about how George in training got Alex Stepney and Paddy Crerand to set him up because he'd noticed an error that Tommy Lawrence, the Liverpool goalkeeper, would make in terms of coming a little bit off his line. He went there, pre-rehearsed, scored the goal, and that's what he was. And I think when you listen to him talk, when you read his books, listen to him in interviews, what was his aim? It was to entertain. And boy, did he entertain, that is for sure. And none of this falling to the ground when kicked, none of this faking injury or anything like that. And he was absolutely lethal. He would cause panic in any defense. And I love that. I love that story. You know, there was a threat on George's life in the early 70s by the IRA, and United were away at Newcastle. And he kind of mentioned he was given the option whether he wanted to play or not. And he opted to play. He said he tried to run around as much as possible to make, if there was a sniper in the crowd, to make it as difficult as possible. Of course, he scored the only goal of the game. And the Newcastle manager, tongue-in-cheek at the end of the game, kind of intimated he wished somebody would have bumped him off during the game because that's how lethal he was. And that's what it was like facing him. He was absolutely unstoppable.
Yeah, naturally, Wayne, hearing Barry's, so to speak, I was going to say diagnosis, but that's not a right word, is it, to use? But hearing Barry's way of describing George Best as a footballer, I think leads us on nicely to remember some of his best moments in a Manchester United shirt in football. And I think if you go back and watch any George Best highlight reel, there's the 6 goals in that mud bath pitch. Was it against Northampton where he just glided across it? And no footballer should have the right to glide across a pitch like that. It was like a stack of horse manure. Like literally, it was an unbelievable service. But what about for you? If you had to name a couple of moments from George Best that will go down for you in some of the greatest sporting moments Manchester United have seen, what games would you allude to? What moments would you allude to from George Best?
Okay, so there are 2 that stand out. If you just, and these can change at any given time on any given day, but on this moment, as you're asking me, the 2 that come to mind, because it is very much like asking you what your favourite song is from your favourite band. It will change all the time because it's George Best, and his level of brilliance was so good that you might just be thinking about something, go, oh, that's definitely my favourite for today, even after all this time, even for people like me who weren't alive to watch him play for Manchester United when he did. But the 2 that come to mind, the first one is 1968, where he scores the goal. He goes around the goalkeeper at Wembley, because that came 10 years after Munich. It won the European Cup, and it was done in George's own style. And the way that his teammates talked about that to me for the book, Paddy Crerand and Alex Stepney, they described it as the most important goal in Manchester United history, and that he was almost encapsulating the spirit of the Babes when he did that. So I think that has to be up there as one of the most important because of everything that it stood for. And the fact that George had talked about doing something like that in the weeks before the game, he talked about, in fact, for months before that, he talked about, I want to score this goal at Wembley where the goalkeeper kicks it up the field, I trap it with my backside on the turf, and then I dribble around the defenders, I dribble around the goalkeeper, and when I get there, the goalkeeper can't get there, so I'm going to head it in off the line or backheel it off the line. And then he gets to that moment actually comes true, basically, without the trapping it with his backside or backheeling. But he gets around the goalkeeper, and you can almost see there's a moment where he realizes what he's done, like he's realized his dream, and he can't do the backheel and he can't do the header. But what he does is teases the goalkeeper. He says, "You might think you might be able to get this," so he kicks it with just enough power to get over the line to make the goalkeeper look like a fool. And that was George. That in the moment of instinct where he's done the thing that he planned to do, he still has this instinct to do something brilliant, to improvise and score this goal that only he could have scored, but meant so much to United. And the other goal that comes to mind is on the same kind of length, really, the same kind of wavelength with that. In 1970, in October, he scored a goal against Chelsea in the League Cup. And I'm sorry, guys, if I know that these two are very popular goals, and I think I might have stole one of you guys' favourite. But he scored this goal against Chelsea in the League Cup, and everyone's seen it again on one of those pitches that you mentioned, Ben. Old Trafford, never great before the turn of the century, really. It was always a mud bath. But it was particularly bad on this day. Chopper Harris, as the guys mentioned earlier, he was there in full chopper mode, going at George, trying to bring him down. And George, in this period of time, had developed his level of brilliance was so good that Alex Stepney described it as being better than the opponent and being so quick that he'd learned how to beat the foul, because that was how he had to train himself, that he knew the foul was coming, but he was now quicker than the tackle and he was quicker than the foul. Now, again, this is one of those things that's difficult to put into modern context for the fan, because for a modern day fan, because they've seen the advent of the rule changes. We all saw the outlaw of the tackle of behind, and we've seen that a couple of times actually. But that was happening at this time as well. They were outlawing these dirty tackles, and they were saying, no more. We're going to protect the better players. And this was 1970, 1971, this period of time where this extra protection was coming in to help George. And it came around the same time as his problems started, which is one of the biggest tragedies. But there was a period where you saw just how frightening he could be. And that was one of these examples where he scored this goal. He stays on his feet even after the tackle and after the foul. He's still got the balance to go around the goalkeeper and score. And then they changed the rules at the start of the next season where you couldn't, where you'd get into a lot of trouble if you did these tackles. And George's form he just skyrocketed. The defenders couldn't get near him because they weren't allowed anymore. And that was when he scored the hat-trick against West Ham, an hat-trick against Southampton. He scored that famous goal where he went around all the Sheffield United players. He was untouchable because of the rule changes. And that was one of the biggest things about how good he was, is that he'd learned through the rough treatment that everyone's already talked about on this show. He'd learned how to handle himself. And then when it came to the rules actually catching up to help him, because he'd learned how to do it, he was again so physically far in front of everyone that it was unthinkable, really. But it's difficult to appreciate that in a modern context because you don't see that kind of evolution of rules at the same time and advent of physicality and everything. But George was doing that, and that's an example of how far ahead he was of his peers, that he was learning that. He was doing that himself. He took it upon himself. It wasn't like, I think Barry said it earlier, he was so brave anyway, but he didn't throw himself to the ground looking for penalties or for free kicks. He just went, you know what? You're going to foul me, so I'm just going to be better than you. And he was. It's as simple as that. It's sometimes with George, the incredible things and the incredulous things that he would do, they're better told in just plain English, if it just relates to you directly, because there's no need to exaggerate. He was that good, and he did do those things, and that's an example of it. That goal against Chelsea, he was just on a different level.
I do feel like I've just asked you a question, Wayne, which is the equivalent to someone asking me, who's your favourite child? That's how I feel when he was answering that question. But some fantastic stories there. And do you know what's great, Wayne? I've given you the first chance to answer. I'm going to ask you guys below the exact same question. So one of them, whoever I dislike the most, will go last, which means they'll struggle to answer the question the most. Go on, Roy. Do you want to quickly chip in on a couple of those?
Yeah, no, I'd just like to mention that game. I was stood in the Stretford End paddock near where the teams come out in those days, halfway line. It was absolutely chucking it down. And Bestie, of course, had the beetle hairstyle, and his black hair was just drenched down. I think his shirt would have been outside his trousers, and the pitch was muddy. And the ball's going towards the Stretford end, just over the halfway line. He's picked it up. And Wayne is correct, but just interestingly, on this particular occasion, Harris did get to him, and he must have kicked him. I am not exaggerating, kicked him at least 4 times. But he shrugged it off, kept going. And I saw a picture which I'd never seen before, only last week. because I'm just doing some on the 70s. And that game was in the October of 1970. And this picture at the end shows Harris on the floor and Peter Bonetti on the floor, where he shrugged Harris off after these 4 or 5 attempts at manslaughter. He's then gone round Bonetti, who was England goalkeeper, top class, and he's the only one on the feet, by the way, by this time, and he's putting the ball into the strap. I mean, it just summed it up. Matador, absolutely magnificent, and like a dismissive look. And I once did a dinner with Ron Harris, and I thought, I've got to ask you. There was 300 people. I was in their territory down south in London. And I said, what do you think about George Best? You're going to love the answer, Ben. He said he was a genius.
He said that the goal was on Grandstand every week for years after that. And Ron Harris, when I interviewed him for the book, Ron Harris complained that he should have got royalties for it.
Hey, if it was a musician and the song was being played, they would have. Who's feeling brave? Who wants to take the question last in terms of favourite moments? Roy or Barry? Who fancies going last? Because
I'll go last.
Roy was just a gentleman, Barry. He said, "Go on, let Barry go next." He opened the door for you, mate. All you had to do was walk through it. Come on, Barry, you can go next. Go on, tell us a few moments from George Best that for you are amongst maybe some of the greatest.
All right. Well, I have to start with a personal moment because it was one of the highlights of my life to meet George. He came and played in South Africa when he quit at Man United. He came here in 1974. He guested for Jewish Guild, and I was a 16-year-old in absolute awe of him, and I met my absolute hero. Where did I meet him? He was in the dressing room of the Guild team. He just arrived in the country, so they didn't play in that particular game, and one of the directors of the club, whom my family knew, took me and introduced me to him. Now, I think my tongue was probably stuck to the roof of my mouth. But the thing that struck me was how softly spoken he was and how friendly he was and how interested he was. He made conversation. We chatted about a few things. I mean, what does a legend talk to a 16-year-old about? We spoke about a few United moments. And I'm going to hold up. This is a picture that he signed to me that I really treasure. And in fact, underneath this, you can't really make it out very well, but he was staying in a hotel in Johannesburg called the Landrost Hotel, and I'd written a card of welcome to him, and lo and behold, I got a reply in the mail from him. So it's a personal thing that I treasure immensely. In terms of iconic moments in his career, I think Wayne put across, reading Wayne's description of that goal, I think those of us that are lovers of United and of George can play it over in our minds. And I'm extremely envious of Roy to have been stood in the Stretford end, I guess, not sitting, the night that he scored that goal. The goals that stick out, of course, are the ones, for example, against Benfica in the European Cup at Benfica, but a couple of others that really stand out for me. They talk about that great goal he scored when he played for San Jose, probably the greatest goal ever seen in the American League. Now, with no disrespect to them, I mean, he beat, I don't know how many players to score that goal, but they weren't really of the highest standard. But if you rewind to a game between United and Rapid Vienna in the European Cup, I think it would have been the European Cup of 1969, he scored a similar goal where he turned a number of defenders inside out in the box. Of course, they were all trying to hack him, and he smashed the ball into the net. That was a great goal that he scored. The goal against Sheffield United in 1971, when Sheffield United were riding high, United under Franco Farrell at the time, in the sunshine, believe it or not, of Old Trafford. I think Wayne or Roy will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think George was wearing the number 10 shirt that day. He got the ball and he ran out wide, beating about 5 Sheffield players, and then smashed it in off the far post, and him looking at the heavens. Fantastic goal. The goal against Spurs when he lobbed Pat Jennings was brilliant. Another goal against Chelsea when Eddie McCready tried, and he ran Eddie McCready ragged. Eddie McCready must If he's still alive, he must be having nightmares about George to this day. McCready tried to clear the ball. George put a foot up. He managed to block the clearance. And then from an acute angle, he lobbed it over Peter Bonetti's head. So he took great delight, I think, in scoring against Chelsea. So that was also a fabulous goal. His goal in the European Cup semi-final against Real Madrid in a 1-0 win in '68 when he lashed the ball into the net was a great goal. So scorer of many, many great goals, that is for sure. And then I'm sorry that I'm chirping in with so many, but
It's all right, Barry. You're making Roy's job even harder. I like that. He's under pressure.
That's on purpose because Roy's watched him so many times. But 2 brilliant goals against Gordon Banks when Banks was playing for Stoke City. United were playing in blue that game. And then I think possibly a goal that he was diddled out of, and that is when Ireland were playing England and he'd noticed the way Gordon Banks cleared the ball. Banks threw the ball up, George flicked it up over his head, nodded the ball in, and the goal was disallowed. I think if there was VAR in those days, it definitely would have been allowed. And just a final comment, maybe, if you'll indulge me, not related to a goal, but in terms of the showman. At one stage, they were discussing who's better, George Best or Johan Cruyff. And Ireland were playing the Netherlands in a European game. And Best, I think, told his teammates he was going to teach Cruyff a bit of a lesson. And what did he do? Nutmegged him. And he told him he was going to do that before the game. And lo and behold, he did that. George Best, the showman. Greatest moment of my life in terms of sport is that I met George Best. Without peer, United's greatest son ever.
Wow, Roy, the pressure really is on. Any additional moments and memories you want to hit on?
I was going to say the pressure is definitely on, considering Barry just named 182 of George's 181 goals. Where is he going to go from there?
Well, I think the only thing I can do to that, because it was so a lovely word he used, is very erudite, and Barry was very erudite there. But a couple of goals that were mentioned. The Liverpool game that Wayne was talking about, 67, when they won 2-1, just to show this wide panoply of goals, this wide range of goals. He actually out-jumped Ronnie Yates, who was a fearsome 6'3", 6'4", built like a brick outhouse, who the famous Bill Shankly once introduced Yates to the Liverpool public by saying to the reporters, "Come and walk around my new centre half," and he out-jumped him at the cup end and headed the ball home in a vital game. United won the title that year. The Sheffield United game that Barry mentioned there, where he picked the ball up in the inside left position, where the United rode paddock, and he came across towards where the paddocks were on the right-hand side, and then suddenly cut in and put the ball in the net. That is the only time since watching United in 1950. The first game at United was Boxing Day 1954. But that game with Sheffield United is the only time I've ever been locked out of Old Trafford. And there must have been about 10,000 outside, because they were redoing the scoreboard for what became K-Stand. And the 10,000, we all virtually stayed the whole game in the sunshine. Barry, you were right. The October Manchester sunshine, just to listen to the roars and everything. But of course, that game as well was on Match of the Day for so long. But I think the Benfica game away and the Benfica in the European Cup, those are the two real ones if you think about it. The display in Lisbon was mesmeric. I mean, nothing else can explain how an 18, 19-year-old lad can actually tear to shreds a team that have been European champions twice, or ish around then, on their own stadium. 75,000. Certainly no team had ever beaten them there. The kickoff put back so Eusebio could get his European Footballer of the Year award. And best 2 goals on there for a 19-year-old. Made him, in my opinion, as I said before, the best player in the world at that time. And then the 4-1 game, which is a bit like the Chelsea game, where he left the goalkeeper stranded and slotted the extra time goal in. At that point, at that night, he most definitely was the greatest footballer in the world. Sadly, and Wayne and I discussed it, he didn't get any better than he did on that night. His career went down, but he was so badly let down, in my opinion, by United. Because if you look at that side, he was the creme de la creme. Dennis wasn't there. He was having his knee operated. Bobby was still a great player, but Bobby's days were going a little bit. Paddy's were, Nobby's were. Alec was still a good goalkeeper. But Best needed those reinforcements. He needed those young legs like him. He needed the Alan Ball type of bustling battery type midfielder. He needed that centre forward, a Malcolm McDonald, or a goal sniffer like Alan Clark. He needed the rock solid defenders. Martin Buchan came, in '72, but they should have been there to help replace Billy Fawkes, particularly, and Nobby. And Best, George was let down badly, in my opinion. Because
sorry, Roy. Can I come in? Because this was actually going to be the next bit that I wanted to hit on. So can I come back to you in just a moment to maybe go in a little bit more detail about that? Before we do, I just want to cross over to Wayne quickly, because I know you cover this in your book, but Best final season at United, Best last few weeks, and how he left United. Was the timing right, Wayne, and what happened?
Yeah, Roy's right. Under Franco Farrell, I want to qualify what Roy said, because although George reached a career pinnacle at 1968 in the final, obviously he did, because he won the European Cup and everything that went with it. But I think his own form stood up. Like when Franco Farrell came in, those rules changed. Yeah. George's own form, he was still the best player around. He was still brilliant, but the level of what that form was doing, it wasn't the cherry on the top of a great team. It was keeping United competitive, and so it was a different kind of thing. The levels of brilliance were still there. Like we've already talked about the Sheffield United goal. The guys have talked about that one. The West Ham hat trick. All that was in the Franco Farrell era. But then when the form dropped off, Franco Farrell he'd sort of gone into Old Trafford and thought, I'm just going to wait and see how long it goes for. A little bit like David Moyes, really. He just waited and he wanted to see how long it would hold out. He should have been more proactive. If he'd had signed Martin Buchan and Ian Storey 4 months earlier, then George might have felt a little bit more galvanised. It might have helped the team. But George felt disillusioned, and obviously he went on record a couple of times as saying that he felt really depressed by the sort of. He was basically getting kicked all over the place, and because he was starting to drink to excess, and his lifestyle was catching up with him, his physicality wasn't what it was basically, and he wasn't able to get away from people, so he was getting kicked all over the pitch every Saturday just to create space for his teammates, and he was getting criticised for his own performance. Having not seen the reward of his performance for the previous 2 years. So he obviously felt like a bit of a pariah, that he was being unfairly treated by his club and by the press as well. So he became so disillusioned with that, he walked away from the game. They convinced him to come back. I don't know if it's a very difficult thing to say when it sort of went wrong and when he should have gone. I think perhaps he should have transferred. Derby County were interested in him, and I'm not saying Brian Clough would have been a good manager for him, considering that Clough had his own problems. But maybe a break would have done George good. But George loved Manchester United. He loved them so much that he wanted to stay and he wanted them to come good. The problem is that when Tommy Docherty brought him back, they very quickly became a period where he learned that George was better as an asset than he was as a player because of the lifestyle that he had, and he wanted to try and sell him without George. George didn't even know anything about that. So this sort of went on behind George's back. The first opportunity that they got really to part ways, they did, and George took a lot of responsibility for that. He thought it was his lifestyle that had caused the rift. Obviously, he played a part in it, but it didn't really create the the irreparable part of it, because that much was down to Doherty, and the club basically said, well, they backed the manager. They'd seen that they'd given George a last chance, and they kind of blown his last chance. And George accepted that. He thought, yeah, I have, and I'll move on. But a measure of how heartbroken George was. I know he played in South Africa, like Barry said, but it took him 2 years, the best part of 2 years, to refine some kind of motivation to actually play professional football again. And that came when, the opportunity of the NASL came about, because all the big names started to go there, like Beckenbauer and Pele and Cruyff. All those names are starting to go to the NASL. And that's when George sort of thought, oh, do you know what? I could still show them a thing or two. He just had to revise his motivation. He was genuinely, you could tell from the way that everything happened in his life for 2 years, he was very, very distressed to have left United. Having said that, I don't know if it's reasonable to say that he could have stayed because of the problems that were there. Maybe if he'd have left a little bit earlier. But one of the big things in George's mind was that he didn't want to leave fans with unhappy memories of him. He was so desperate to sort of get back to his brilliance in the difficult period of Doherty that he was distressed by his own level of performance as well. Even though people were saying that he was the best player on the pitch, even in that brief spell, I think he only played 12 games under Doherty, and people were still saying in some of those, oh, George is still the best player. But it wasn't the same kind of George. Even, the likes of Brian Greenough and Sammy McElroy, who idolised him, they knew that it wasn't the same George. He might well have been if he'd had another 2 or 3 months to lose the weight that he was carrying. But that initial burst of pace that he had before he gained the weight, that physicality that set him apart from everyone, that had gone. And George had a tough time reconciling with himself, really, that had gone and he couldn't get it back. And I don't think he really did realise that until the latter years of his career. But it very much distressed him, the fact that his time at United was over, and it took him a long time to come to terms with that. And a lot of United fans as well, to be honest.
I was just going to say there, Wayne, for you, Barry, George Best was distressed to leave Manchester United. So how did you feel, Barry, at the time as a Manchester United fan?
It was that period as a United supporter. We've got many young fans these days. They don't realise they've been spoilt by the Fergie era and so many trophies. But United in the 70s was a very difficult time, and they were mainly a cup team. Of course, we won an FA Cup in 1977. We got to FA Cup finals in 1976 and 1979. We got beaten in quite a few semi-finals. So it was not a good period for the club. And of course, relegation at the end of the 73-74 season. So it was horrible to see my idol deteriorate like that. And of course, one doesn't want to remember those days. There weren't that many of them. He certainly wasn't the same player. He was carrying weight. And I think Wayne and Roy have put across very, very well the fact that when he was at the pinnacle of his career, United should have strengthened, and they didn't. They allowed so many people to grow old. So it was a real period of transition for United. And this period of transition really went on for the entire decade of the 70s. So it was distressing to see. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to backtrack on one thing. Nowadays, when a player's been out injured and he comes back and he plays and we get told, oh, he's not sharp, he's not match fit. When George scored the 6 goals against Northampton, he came back from a 6-week suspension. He hadn't played a game for 6 weeks and gets on the pitch and scores 6 goals. And that's the measure of the man. So I certainly, as a United fan and as a George Best fan, just remember all those iconic moments. We don't dwell on these lesser times, for want of a better term, but it was certainly, as somebody that I idolized, it was distressing to see him like that. There was a brief period of excitement, of course, when he came back to England and played for Fulham, because they were really they were almost like Calypso games, and you could see that there was a fun element to that. And I think that this is something that Wayne has documented superbly well. is that George's career after leaving United, because not much has been written about that. And there were certainly some great times that that he had at Fulham and in the USA, and one remembers him for those as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic there, Barry. Thank you for that. And can I just say, we've had some fantastic comments on the show today, but I want to bring one up. Which wins the show for me today. Hello to Jax. Legacy fans are the best. Thank you, Jax. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment. And it is absolutely spot on. Thank you, Jax, for joining in this evening, and everyone else in the live chat as well. Look, Roy, sticking on that, and look, I know what Barry was saying there, we don't want to hit too much on the times, but obviously, the way Best did leave was distressing for everyone. And at the time, it was, of course, a huge thing. Why didn't everything that everyone said so far, why didn't United do more to build that team around Best, to go on and do more? What was happening at the time which was stopping that, do you believe?
I think going back to 1968, the victory at Wembley against Benfica was obviously Matt Busby's. It really was his holy grail. I mean, to have survived what he survived and to have built so many great teams, and then incredibly, I mean, I thought about this the other night. I just wrote it down and boldly wrote it down and thought about it. 10 years after a Munich air crash, which had took 8 players and 2 others never to play again and left scars all over the place. 10 years after that, they won the European Cup. Now, I mean, that just, you write it down and read it to yourself. It's incredible. But Matt did not help strengthen the team after that. Willie Morgan signed, but there was definite deficiencies. Billy Foulkes was asked to stay on. We needed a centre half. Nobby then started getting knee injuries. As I say, Dennis had these knee injuries as well. Bobby and Pat were obviously getting that bit older as well. And George was really carrying the side. Wayne is absolutely right. That period under O'Farrell from August till Christmas, he played some magical football, some absolutely magical football. But I interviewed George in 1983 for a book, and if you bear with me, these are his quotes. This is off the tape. He was speaking seriously but passionately now. It's always difficult to replace faithful and good players who have served the club well. But I thought Manchester United needed to be ruthless, and they weren't. So players who really needed replacing were allowed to play on, and the team slowly began to slide. He summed it up by saying, my first 5 years as a Manchester United player were unbelievable. The rest should have been. And I put a deeper thinker about the game than most people gave him credit for. Now, I think that was it. It just needed 1 or 2. I mean, we can all virtually go a full team that we're supposed to sign, but just 2 or 3 of those players would have been absolutely magical and could have changed the whole story.
Yes, good points, well made. And I think now's probably, we've just gone over an hour, so I think now's probably the best time to reflect on George Best off the pitch. And look, I don't want to talk about tabloid stuff. I don't want to talk about rumours. I want to talk about exactly what you've done with your book, Wayne. I want to talk about the positivity. I want to talk about the real person George Best was off the pitch. For you, how would you sum up George Best, the man?
Well, Roy just mentioned there that he was a conscientious guy, he was a deep thinker. But if I could just jump back to one thing that Roy did mention, and the guys have already mentioned it about the sentiment and the team being rebuilt and everything like that, and the players that should have been replaced. I think one thing that gets forgotten sometimes is that, I think it's a fair comment that Bill Foulkes, for example, is the most obvious player that could have been replaced and that perhaps Busby could have been ruthless. But let's say that he did do that. You might not have had Bill Foulkes running up like galloping like a wardrobe to score this goal in Madrid. That's the value of sentiment. And that's a memory that Manchester United fans, he was there on the pitch at Wembley in 1968, as he should have been 10 years after Munich as a survivor of that. So, that for me is that's the value of sentiment. So you wouldn't, yeah, okay, you could replace him, but then what are you losing by doing that? And it was a very difficult line for Busby to straddle, to sort of know what people want to blame him for that. They want to say that he was too loyal, but I think, yeah, maybe he was. But, you know, that was a price that United paid. I just wanted to make that point because sometimes what is lost is sometimes the thing that we always talk. We talk about what could have been gained by the change, but sometimes we don't concentrate on what could have been lost. And we could have easily lost that year of Bill Foulkes doing what he did, and he deserved to be there for that. But George, like Roy said, was a conscientious guy. He was a deep thinker. He did think of all of these kind of things. He wanted to compete against the best. It was like an internal crisis that he went through for many years, especially, looking at the likes of Cruyff, who became the best player in the world. And Barry mentioned it earlier, the game that George played against him for Northern Ireland when he was recalled into the team. He went straight for Cruyff to prove that he was better than him on a one-on-one basis. So those kind of things he was obviously carrying with him. Yeah, he wanted to prove that he was better than Pelé. He still wanted to be the best. Towards the end of his career, he wanted to try and be part of the Northern Ireland squad that had qualified for the 1982 World Cup. And his personal pride was the thing that got him in the end, because this was a period just after he scored that goal in the NASL where he went round everyone. But his knees were really struggling. He was having injections every week. He played a lot of indoor football there, and that was terrible on his knees. So he was going through this kind of thing, and he came back to England wanting a bit of a farewell victory tour, which started with trying to sell himself to Manchester United under Ron Atkinson. Never happened. And then Sammy McElroy at the time saying, I think if he'd got him, he was in pretty good nick and he should have come with us for the World Cup. But George realised, I think, he wanted to sell himself to United, but he knew that version of himself wasn't the pinnacle of George Best. And on reflection, he was like, if I can't be the George Best of 10 years earlier, I don't want them to see me like this as my last memory. I don't want to be this George Best that goes to a World Cup. Do you know what I mean? And there's a great dignity in that, I felt. But I think he carried around the United thing with him for a lot longer than he should have done. But he didn't know the truth behind his exit, to be fair. He took that much responsibility for it. There were all these things that he took responsibility for. The death of his mother, he took responsibility for that. He took, Ian talked to me about he was a prominent footballer himself, but he gave the game up because of everyone saying that he's going to be the next George Best. And George felt responsible for that. He wanted his family around him, but his family were not used to that kind of level of celebrity. Like George wasn't, he wasn't used to it. Everyone was following him around everywhere. George had learned to use the media, but his family couldn't because it was alien to them. It was really alien to George. He was the only person experiencing that kind of thing. So it must have been, in some respects, a very lonely life for him, even when he had, he had a family and he tried to settle down as much as he can or as much as he could. It must have been a very lonely lifestyle for him because of the goldfish bowl that he led his life in, and also the fact that the hypocritical standards society held for him. I wrote about it in the book that he was put on Wogan as he was portrayed as this like desperate alcoholic, and sometimes sort of led down the garden path with it to sort of make him drunk before appearances, which was despicable, really. And they characterized him, they made him out to be this drunk and everything like that, instead of helping him when he was obviously suffering from an illness. Society, the media didn't help him because they just saw him as someone to knock down. He knew that, and he played it for a while. But by that point, by the 80s, he already had the illness. Do you know what I mean? And obviously had to make a living. So, a living for a footballer in the 80s was either you buy a pub, and that wouldn't have been a good idea for George, or get in the media. And he was a good talker in the media. He was a very good thinker. A player like George Best couldn't be a coach or a manager because he's too far. It'd be like, I couldn't imagine, David Beckham wouldn't be a manager. Ronaldo, you can't imagine being a manager. so the players are too far above the game to be that. And George was that level of brilliance that, how can he explain to people what he was doing himself off the time? He changed his mind. As Rodney Marsh told me, he changed his mind in the middle of a move once. So, yeah, complicated time for George for many years after that, but very deep thinker, very intelligent guy, knew loads about the game. But as Rodney Marsh said, his first love was Manchester United, and obviously that was his biggest heartbreak, and he never got over it.
Do you know what? Slightly too early for me. I only learned the other day that George Best was a regular on Soccer Saturday in the early days of that program. Well. Yeah, and I heard that as well. I think Chris Kamara done an interview and said one of the best panelists they've ever had, George Best. Yet people don't talk about him having done that nowadays when they speak about George Best and what he did after football, which is quite fascinating. But what I also love about this show, by the way, Wayne, we've come full circle. One of the first questions I asked was about George Best, young, growing up, his early time at United, and we spoke about the shy small guy that he was walking into that change room with all the household names. And then one of the biggest stories that we've hit on in the past 10 minutes is him being ambitious and confident enough to stand up to Cruyff and tell him, I'm going to do this to you, which just goes to show the journey George Best went on from a young lad to his peak and to his pinnacle, which I think is absolutely fantastic. What a number of stories we've had on the show. I want to come over to you quickly, Roy, because you've obviously had the pleasure of interviewing George, and you've spoken a lot about some of the meets you've had with George Best. Have you got any stories from those meets, and how did you always perceive George Best?
Well, he was a hero to me. Yeah, I mean, he was only a year older than me, but he was a hero. I mean, you looked up to him. One of the things after the Benfica game when they won 5-1, he got this full-length leather coat, and you just had to have one. You just had to have one because he was an influencer. But I did quite a few times after dinner where I was the host and George was the speaker. But there was one night in deepest downtown Rottenstall near Burnley, where George was actually the speaker, and I was just in the audience, and he come and sat with me and a guy called Fred Eyre, who was a very famous guy around the Manchester area, footballer, played for 26 different clubs, a lot non-league, a great raconteur. And he came and sat with us, and Frank Carson was actually with us as well. He was the comedian, and he was going to go off to Norway, somewhere like that, in the next week or two, because obviously drink. When I knew him at 16, he was Coca-Cola. He was shy, good-looking guy, but he was one of the guys. He was not, I'm George Best now, etc. And he certainly wasn't drinking in those days. But he did have this problem, and this is 1983, and he was going to go to Norway and have something implanted in his stomach to try and stop him drinking. And I saw him about 2-3 years after. I said, "Hey, what happened there?" He said, "Well, 12 months." He said, "It worked. I never went for a drink at all." He said, and then I was in Los Angeles and or down California way somewhere, and he was on a beach. And he said, "I just went in a bar." He said, and unfortunately, it kicked off again. I have one story about him where I remember hosting this dinner in Southport, Scarisbrick Hotel, Friday night, and it was the Liverpool plant contractors' annual dinner. There was 180 Scousers, and they were expecting George Best and Rodney Marsh to be the guest speakers, which they were. Anyway, I got there 7:20 for it was 7:30 for 8 o'clock. And about 8:20, they came to me and said, "There's a phone call for you. So you're ringing me here." And this lady said, "Hi, Roy." She said, "How does George get there?" I said, "Well, where is he?" She said, "He's in the Midland Hotel." Well, I only know one Midland Hotel, and that's the one in Manchester. So I said, "That's quite away from Southport." I said, "Yes." They jump in a taxi, and they came to Southport. And they were just, all these Scousers just dived on him really, and they only did 20 minutes question and 20 minutes answer, where I think the organisers thought they were going to get 40 minutes of both, and they buggered off back to Manchester in the taxi, him and Rodney, and I was left London 82 unhappy Scousers, but that's the only time George didn't live up to his ultimate genius, as far as I was concerned. Fantastic guy. Still remember him, can still see him, and just in my opinion, we all have our different ones. We see the great players, and you never forget them. But in my opinion, the greatest.
It's interesting there, Barry, hearing about his personalities and his traits. Obviously, someone from, I know you met him a couple of times, but even further afar, you've mentioned the word hero quite a few times, Barry. Is there anything that you remember that either was reported from in the dressing room, maybe, or a story you've heard, or maybe something that did come out in the tabloids that really cemented your love for George Best as a person as much as a footballer?
Right. I think I'm going to ask Wayne. Wayne, would you mind if I read a couple of sentences from your book?
Yeah, cool. Be my guest.
I want to read something to you that Wayne wrote.
Barry,
And, yeah,
if you're good, we'll contract you to do the audio book.
with the South African accent, I doubt that I'll be contracted.
Yeah, Wayne, don't offer him that gig.
But Wayne wrote towards the end of the book, the two opponents, even he could never evade, were controversy and tabloid newspapers. The two he could never defeat, alcoholism and time. And I think that sums up the latter part of George's life really very, very, very well. And I think that he was very, very badly treated by a lot of hangers-on towards the end of his days. And where people should have been trying to help him, he almost became this kind of party animal or this attraction, get the guy laced with alcohol and he'll give you a hilarious evening. And I think looking back on that, whoever was involved in episodes like that should absolutely hang their heads in shame, because it's utterly disgusting what went on. But what comes out as well, I think, is George Best, the man, the family man. He seems to have had a love for children. He had great love for his family. And I think that he was always very generous with respect to his time to fans, for example. And certainly when he was here in South Africa, we used to go and watch him training. And I kid you not, on the training ground, he'd get the ball in his own penalty box from the goalkeeper and he'd dribble up the field. He'd beat the whole team and put the ball in the net. And it was just mesmerizing to watch him. But at the end of the training sessions, watching him interact with kids, I enjoyed that, I have to say. So for me, George Best, the man, wonderful guy, unfortunately afflicted with a disease that probably has some genetic predispositions because it affected his mother as well. And I can't fault him for that. And it was with immense sadness. The last time I ever saw George was sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s. He was doing a book signing at the Megastore at Manchester, and he really did not look well. With a medical eye, I could obviously that he was jaundiced, he was gaunt, he really didn't look well. Yet there he was, absolutely mobbed by the fans, and that was George Best, that even an ill George Best attracted a bigger crowd than the other players did. And that is how I'll remember him. A humane man, a wonderful man, and just for me, the greatest footballer that's ever drawn breath.
And had time, as you mentioned, the crowd had the time for the people, which is obviously a massive personality trait and says a lot about him as a man.
Some of the lads that I've met in the UK that were friends of his tell me that when they used to socialise with him, for example, on a Saturday night, he could have put in the best performance that he'd ever put in on the football field. Never spoke about it. Didn't look for compliments with respect to that. Got on with it and didn't even chat about it. For me, the measure of greatness.
We started off the show talking about what his first autobiography could have been called, The Word Genius, Too Modest. And I think, again, that's another prime example of George Best being the modest man that he clearly was, isn't it? Again, full circle, and it all adds up. All the pieces to the jigsaw add up and create that fantastic jigsaw piece. In the middle of it at the end is George Best's face, and genius, true genius, being the phrase, I think that is a perfect phrase for your book, Wayne. Look, we end every tribute show with this. And maybe you'll repeat yourself, but I think it's something that we have to ask, and a question we all have to answer at the end of a show like this. If there's a moment, how would you remember? Whether it's a moment, it's a number of things, it's a collective of things. When I say the name George Best to you, Wayne, how do you remember him?
I'll choose a different one to the goals that I picked. The moment that probably sums up George at his brilliant peak was the second goal he scored against Benfica in '66. If you watch that back when you can, because the video is widely available, there's not enough space. And Barry's a doctor, so I'm sure he'll be able to confirm the physics are pretty near impossible on this. There's not enough space between the markers that it seems physically possible that George can weave in and out of them. He shouldn't be able to do it, but he does. He's like a bird flying between two buildings at speed that you just can't even imagine. And whenever I think about how good he was, if I was to explain, just to provide one example, I'd just say, watch that 2 seconds of footage, see how he does that, and then try and work out how he did it, because it's almost impossible. The more that you watch it, the more impossible it seems that he did it. You try and work out, the logistics behind it, and that was George in a nutshell, because he just did things that, obviously there are things like the Chelsea goal and things like that, but you watch them and you think, oh, that's brilliant that he did that. But it's that act against Benfica where he weaves in and out that you just think, how did that even happen? And I think for people like Roy and like Barry who got to watch him play live, I'm pretty sure that the words "how did that happen" probably were said nearly every time he scored a goal.
Making the seemingly impossible possible, I think, there for Wayne. What about you, Roy? How will you remember George Best?
I remember him as a 16-year-old lad who 5 years later was the greatest footballer in the world. He was a hero to me, and I was only a year younger than him. He was the greatest footballer I've seen over that length of time. Duncan, of course, had 5 years. George did have 10 years, and they were great years, as Wayne said, after those first 5 as well. A genius.
A genius, a hero from Roy. Barry, how will you remember the great George Best?
I'll remember George in 2 ways. Number one, meeting him in that dressing room of Jewish Guild Football Club, leather jacket, pair of flannels, really good-looking guy, and thinking to myself, I've just met my hero. An unbelievable moment in my life. And from a footballing perspective, turning around to receive the adulation after scoring that second goal at Wembley against Benfica, number 7 shirt, arm raised aloft. That was the pinnacle of George Best as a footballer. And I remember him as an absolute genius. And in terms of describing how he got through those couple of Benfica defenders, Wayne, I think you will have to find a genius physicist to answer that question for you, because he probably defied the laws of physics that night.
Guys, that was absolutely incredible. Just a couple of notes before we finish. Roy has a new book coming out soon on the 70s in football and some of the most iconic moments in the 70s. That's right, isn't it, Roy?
Yeah.
I think we're going to try and plan another show around that, aren't we? And we're going to do something for that to celebrate the release. I'd love to do that, Roy. Always a pleasure to be in your company. Yeah. Barry's always loved being in your company. I'm just so happy we didn't have to talk about the Super League with you, because you would have been on for about 7 hours.
Ben, I feel very inferior that I'm the only one on the panel who has not written a book. I really feel very, very inferior to these gentlemen.
Put your pen up, Barry. You've got so many memories.
And you've contributed to a few out there as well. And Wayne has given you so much credit at the very start of this show for some of the knowledge that you helped him out with. And Wayne, honestly, I've heard a lot of feedback on your book, and it's truly remarkable. Yeah. Some of the things that you've done with it, and just looking online at the reaction, honestly, well done, Wayne. Fair play. So just one more time, Wayne, please tell everyone about your book and where they can get it.
Yep, True Genius out now. Amazon, all good bookshops. Pop down to your local Asda now and buy it, apparently. So yeah, it's there. It's available everywhere. And yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's been great talking with you guys about George.
Some of the stories mentioned on this show, of course, and some of the talking points also mentioned in a lot more detail within the book. So go and get it, please. True Genius, The Untold Story and George Best. Please go and check it out. A very much a positive spin on his life and his greatness and his heroics, to be frank. Wayne, thank you so much. Roy, thank you so much. Barry, thank you so much. That's an hour and a half done. Thank you guys for joining us. If you've got to this point, you've watched it all through as a recording, please hit that like button. Subscribe to All for United. So much content coming up over the next couple of weeks. And of course, as I said, we'll be back with more tributes and special shows within the coming weeks and months. Thank you guys. Stay safe out there, and we will speak to you soon. Ciao for now.